Okay, good morning. Welcome on the second day of the fourth PostNormal Science Symposium on PostNormal Science as a movement. My name is Jeroen van der Sluis from the Center for the Studies of the Sciences and the Humanities in Bergen, and I will chair the morning session. And we begin with a presentation by Annika Nilsson. She is from the Stockholm Environmental Institute and affiliate faculty in environmental politics at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. She has an undisciplined, mixed background with various competencies blended together in what you could call environmental studies, studying the science policy interface. And she will talk about navigating a new landscape amidst contested knowledges, politics, and futures.
Okay, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a bit of a treat to come to a completely new community with new faces and sitting and listening. I've really enjoyed yesterday's talks. My work centers very much around Arctic issues in various ways, shapes, and forms. And even if you're not engaged in the Arctic in your daily lives, you've probably seen images by now, something like that, where the melting sea ice and the dramatic shift in the physical geography of the northern polar region that we have seen in recent years, they have become iconic. And here you can see a little bit how big difference it is from what was previously. They have become iconic of a new era and a symbol of global climate change, really, and that's why you've seen it from the Arctic, where you probably wouldn't have seen pictures from the Arctic if it hadn't had a global significance. And if you, like me, have worked with the environmental communication, you might also have thought that such an image would serve as a real potent signal for politicians to take the impacts of climate change seriously, that they would actually start doing something about the emissions of greenhouse gases. But that's not what happened in the Arctic when these new images came out, and when they were broadcast really across the world. The first, the sea ice minima of 2007 and then 2012. What happened instead was a surge in political and commercial interest in the region, with visions of access to new resources. You have here all the various places where there might be oil or gas, or visions of new shipping routes that could take commercial trade from Asia to Europe and vice versa. Since then, a drop in oil prices and in mineral prices have brought a more somber tone to what seemed almost like a Klondike-like rush, and it's not the first Klondike-like rush you've had in the Arctic. But the Arctic has become part of the world where both countries with territory in the region and powers from across the world find it very useful to project their own images of what the future should be, their own visions of what the future should be. And these are not actual shipping routes. These are visions projected on as if they were there on a kind of a satellite composite image of the sea ice. The environmental damage from new industrial activities has then become not an issue of actually questioning what those industries are doing, but something to be managed. Rather, something to, how do we deal with that so that we can still develop the industrial Arctic? Not to rethink the logic about what is causing the declining sea ice in the first place. Based on those theories of environmental communication, the dramatic declining sea ice had all the ingredients of a story with potential to shift a prevailing narrative. Shift the idea that the climate change was a potential future challenge to an immediate and urgent concern. Instead, the messages came to follow an old colonial Arctic narrative of opening the region for business. We had the smoking gun. Didn't we have it all? Yeah, we had the visible signals, the smoking gun. This is the IPCC, and you see the global warming is the Arctic where it's the worst. Satellite technology and global modeling, of course, helped with that, presented often in visually appealing ways. We had the scientific evidence that this was actually linked to emissions of greenhouse gases. I just took this image as one example of the projections of what will happen with different emission trajectories. We also had well-established fora for the science policy interface, both globally within the IPCC and in the Arctic with the Arctic Council. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Arctic region, the Arctic Council is a high-level forum for international collaboration between 8 Arctic states and 6 indigenous peoples organizations. And in 2004, before the sea ice minimum, the Arctic Council presented the results of a circumpolar assessment of the impacts of climate change in the region with a very clear message that it was something that was happening here and now. So the information wasn't missing, and it had been produced within a context where there was good potential for uptake. There was no politician who could say that they didn't know. They did not know, however, that there would be a sea ice minimum. Even the scientists didn't know that. That 2004 report did not predict that sea ice minimum. Came as a complete surprise. We also had knowledge brokers from both science and from indigenous peoples. This is Sheila Cloutier, who became a very vocal spokesperson for what was going on in the Arctic. She was chairing the Inuit Circumpolar Council and had previously worked on the impacts of persistent organic pollutants on indigenous peoples in the Arctic, very successfully in actually pushing the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, where the Arctic is mentioned as a signal region. And we had well-established epistemic communities for common understanding of the problem at hand. We have 2 versions here. One is the typical polar expedition, but also with traditional knowledge. Within an international polar year in 2007-2008, there were several projects, this one among them, SIKU, where indigenous peoples and natural scientists were working side by side to try to understand what was going on with the ice. So, what was missing? We need to think back on what shaped the notions we have about effective communication at the science policy interface and the role of science in society, and ask ourselves some very critical questions of why we failed in addressing the causes of climate change. I think it must include critically assessing both theory and practice. I started working with environmental communication in the 1980s as a science journalist at the Swedish National Radio. One of the issues I covered was emissions of sulfur and nitrogen, which were linked to forest damage and were known to cause acidification in soil and lakes, and in the case of nitrogen, also overload of nutrients to the environment. The emissions of these substances have actually been rather effectively controlled, especially the air emissions, and guided by international agreements of transboundary air pollution. And one important explanation for the success has been summarized in the notion of epistemic communities. The professional networks of experts with capacity to frame the issue in such a way that it could shape policy. In this case, it was the science and technical expertise who talked about the notion of critical loads and producing these kinds of, again, visual images that helped policymakers understand what was going on. The power is, in a sense, to persuade politicians to conform to consensual, knowledge-driven idea. And that's very much how we think about science communication. But in the case of the Arctic, that was obviously not sufficient. Even if the Arctic as such is ripe with epistemic communities. And even if we have things like the Paris Agreement and things, after a few months of optimism, kind of peters off. We had the 1.5-degree report from IPCC not long ago, and there was lots of things in the papers, and now tension is slowly petering off. Another high-profile issue in the 80s was ozone depletion. The issue had been on the political agenda since the 70s when the first concerns were voiced about stable compounds with chlorine and fluorine, so-called freons. They were used extensively in spray cans, and scientific insights about how these compounds behave in the atmosphere raised concerns that they could, in the long run, maybe destroy the atmosphere's ozone layer. And that set in motion a scientific assessment. That was before the attention to the ozone hole had come. But just as they were about to sign the convention, the first signs of this, the first knowledge about this ozone hole came out, and accompanied again by these powerful visuals. And many have argued that these powerful issues was one of the reasons why actually you had action quite soon on cutting emissions of these compounds. And there are many ways to explain, other ways to explain the success in a sense of the ozone story, because it's actually healing now, as I led last reports. Karen Litvin, in her seminal work on ozone discourses, talked about knowledge brokers in shaping a new discourse, people who could serve then as a bridge between science and policy communities, often with excellent communication skills. There was also a strong focus on technology transfer to help transitions to less harmful chemicals in many applications that were using these compounds. And I was working at the time, 1990, this is from, I was working on a brochure for a very diverse group of funders. This was funded by the Swedish Corporation of Industries, a Swedish environmental NGO, and to Swedish EPA and to the Swedish scientific academies. And I wrote, in the end, a hopeful sign, and in my naivety I would say, hopeful sign is that ozone discussion may provide a model for technology transfer and sharing of resources. If successful, it will also be an important step in dealing with global warming and its effect. Failure is not an option. This was in 1990. Unfortunately, looking at the Arctic today and the extreme weather event and consequences of climate change across the world, we did fail, and we need to ask ourselves why. Interestingly for me is that ozone issue is also one of that brought me in contact with the PostNormal Science idea for the first time when I read a PhD dissertation from Gothenburg University by Jan Olin about the ozone discussion. And one of the issues that I picked up from them was very much this thing of problems are wicked, that they cannot be identified in simple terms. But also, later in the 1990s, I was traveling down to Antarctica. When I came home, and I was traveling with a research group that was measuring how the ozone hole affected plankton. So we were sitting with the ship basically at the edge of the ozone hole, going in and out of the ozone hole. When I came home, I had my first encounter with allegations of fake science. I just come home and someone told me that they heard that the ozone hole was a hoax. So the idea of fake science and how it affects the discussion is not a new one. It was around at that time. Back to theory. In my own work, this sociological turn of study of science and knowledge has been really, really profound, and the role of social learning as an alternative to the one-way communication notion is really what shaped what I have worked on for most of my professional life. And it's also, of course, the foundation for Sheila Yasanov's work on co-production of knowledge, and we heard some presentations about co-production of knowledge yesterday. And another work that I think was profound was I worked in several scientific assessments about pollution in the Arctic, mainly relating to persistent organic pollutants and metals and those kinds of things, not so much climate change. And ran across a work that talked about it has to be scientifically credible. That's kind of standard. It has to be salient, and that we all agree on. But it also pointed out in order for a environmental assessment, a global environmental assessment of the IPCC kind, and not the project-specific ones, but these larger ones, they also have to be legitimate. And I think this issue of legitimacy is where we have some of the conflict lines today, and some of the explanations why we have actually failed in getting some kind of political action when all the signs are there. Scientific processes, including efforts of co-production of knowledge, such as the IPCC, are simply not seen as legitimate. In fact, their legitimacy is actively challenged by rather powerful forces, such as the coal lobby. And for every allegation of fake science, similar to the allegations of fake news, legitimacy of these processes are further undermined. And if a narrative about causes and effect of climate change is scientifically credible or not really does not matter. So whatever quality assurance you would have on the science, it doesn't matter if the process is not legitimate. That is the conclusion I have come to. In the Arctic, I saw this play out in relation to a process that was called the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment that I mentioned before. This report came out in 2004-2005, where one big country to the west insisted that the process that it had been carried out with was not legitimate, and it had US scientific leadership, but nevertheless, and it could therefore not serve as the basis for policy conclusions. I would say the knowledge brokers were too effective. They brought the knowledge and they got scared in the US, because here came something that really shifted the discussion in terms of knowledge, but they were not ready for the policy. Indeed, the whole regional cooperation in the Arctic was about to fall apart, and eventually there was a weak policy agreement, but after a well-staged name and shame campaign coordinated by scientists, indigenous peoples, and in covert collaboration with media. The New York Times got a leaked copy of the report, and the US delegation were simply pushed to agree to something to not look really bad. Things eased up under the Obama administration, but any criticism of the Arctic Council for not acting on mitigation has remained a sore point up until today. An example is when I worked on the Arctic Resilience Report, where I headed a chapter on learning within the Arctic Council. The original version took up some of this in rather diplomatic terms, I would say, but at a very late stage, way past the review process, there were changes in the text pushed by the US government representatives. And I ended up actually publishing the original version as a separate report, at least to have it documented. So those kinds of things go on under the surface. And we see the same thing, but we see this kind of erosion of legitimacy of processes being and the lack of legitimacy, how that is really serious in a completely different way and different political dynamics with mining in the Arctic. Here it's the indigenous peoples who have no faith in the formal processes of environmental impact assessment and related to, the giving of permission to mine on their traditional lands. It's very visible among the Sami in Sweden and creating big conflicts. And this is, in this context, I'm working with some of my current research, where together with my colleague Rasmus Klokke-Larsen developed a heuristic model to manage the knowledge production process in this highly, highly contested context. And it builds on the notion that you can't ignore existing conflicts. And instead, I was thinking of that co-production will solve the problem. Instead, you have to find ways of defining your research in a way that you actually deal with a conflict. And this is available also in published form. And you can see here how we positioned ourselves in relation to post-normal science, in a sense, another step that needs to be taken when you have these really controversial, with big power differentials. And we're running now a project where we're looking at doing a systematic map of the published literature, but at the same time doing a mapping of Sami local knowledge about the impacts of mining But then, of course, you run into the problem where you also have to deal with the mining industry, and they say, well, that image is just feelings. So when you're credible and it seems legitimate with one audience, you lose credibility and legitimacy with another one. And we're in the process of navigating that. I don't know whether we will manage. So there are also many things with this. I mean, how do you manage equality in practice with knowledge productions, and let alone decision making, when you actually have institutional frameworks that favor some actors? And how do you, as you said, address comments from industry that it's about feelings and not facts? And how do you keep your whole project legitimate to all actors? And if you look at that in global scope, such as mitigation of climate change, I'm not sure that it's even possible. And I think that maybe we have erroneously defined the problems in a wrong way. And that is the conclusion when I start investigating for myself, and this is really a self-scrutiny. Why doesn't it work? And we have defined the issue as a communication gap. But I don't think it is a communication gap. It's a matter of conflicting interest. And if we don't realize it's a matter about conflicting interest, it doesn't matter how much communication efforts and how skillful we are at getting good pictures and how many boundary organizations, and no matter what we create, those conflicting interests, if they're strong enough and if they're fundamental enough, are not going to go away. And that, I think, is, if you look at mining in Sweden, it's basically a conflict of land use. There is a limited amount of land, and there are many actors who want to use that land in incompatible ways. So there's no simple way of getting win-win situations. And I think we should be careful about saying that there are always win-win situations, when there really aren't always. We have political issues, and they need to be solved as political issues. And we've seen environmental politics is often couched in a matter of coordination and alignment of interests. And when that is possible, science can play a major role in shifting narratives and shifting emphasis. But if there are still losers at the end, and if those potential losers are powerful, they will fight. We have seen this with the coal lobby and its influence in the US, and such basic conflicts between the fossil fuel industry and those who are concerned about climate change are likely to remain, no matter how good the science is, and no matter how beneficial it would be for society. And we've, in a sense, seen similar things with the chemicals industry. I was saying some positive things about managing very well in terms of getting rid of some of the worst persistent organic pollutants that contain chlorine, bromine, and fluorine. But those industries have invented new chemicals with those that are now turning up in the environment and that are causing problems. And you know, there are more and more chemicals of those from those chemical industries. So it's not as, that doesn't get as much attention as the climate issue. But the basic problem is the same. And I think we have to realize that there's just a conflicting interest between those industries and the environmental goals. So how do we then as researchers work in such contested fields? Some choose to be action researchers and work to empower those who have limited, say, in the past. And we heard some examples of here yesterday. And I have colleagues who are involved with the impacts of mining, working with Sami communities, some calling themselves action researchers, some not calling themselves that, but are driven by the same type of logic and the same inspirations. Others highlight the need to nudge industry from the inside, to work together with industry. And we had an example of that as well. However, I think in such contested landscapes, I think it's essential to also have truly independent research. That is not action research aligning with a specific NGO or local or vulnerable group interests, no matter how good that is in and of itself. And I'm not saying that that research shouldn't exist. That should also be there. I think we also need to not always be caught up in the co-production knowledge and stakeholder engagement that it becomes impossible to say things that are uncomfortable. And what happens is there's kind of a self-censorship that comes in, even when there is no formal limitation to breaking silent rules on how to behave. This independent role is probably not too easy to maintain. It's not what funders call for. They actually embrace many of the notions in post-normal science these days. They want stakeholder involvement, they want co-production of knowledge, they want all kinds of things. But it's also not basic research, what I'm talking about, that has kind of a different logic, and it doesn't follow the normal, kind of normal science, if I've used your terminology here. So those venues of funding are not available either. And if you talk about sustainability science, not engaging with stakeholders, not engaging in the co-production knowledge is swearing. So, but I think societies have always been dependent on actors who speak freely without looking over their shoulders. And that's why politicians sometimes, and sometimes not, emphasize the importance of the free press. That's why it becomes controversial when politicians want to steer detail over culture in some countries, but not in all countries, as we know. That is also why there was a court jester who could say things out loud, even to an audience of royalty, saying things that needed to be said, though they had to say it in a joking manner, not to be seen subservient. I don't know what a post-normal science would be, what would look like, what epistemological foundation it would do. I do know that there is something we need to think seriously about if we as researchers are to play a useful role in relation to addressing global environmental change and how it plays out in specific parts of the world, such as the Arctic. We have tried the ways that we thought would work, and they didn't. And just to leave you with some pictures of northern Sweden, and at least one of these is a very contested one, or shows a very contested place. I'll leave for you to figure out which one.